Okay, 3, 2, 1, it's jam.
What's up, science fam? In the last video, we had a review of Mendelian genetics. You had 3 different laws, and they're all kind of complicated. So the law of segregation, they just separate. Whoop. Law of independent assortment, if you have one gene and another gene, they don't affect one another. And the law of dominance, the dominant allele will overwhelm the recessive allele. That's not that complicated at all. So now, in this video, we actually do get complicated. Okay, let's get right into it. What if the genes don't follow Mendel's laws? Does that mean Mendel is wrong? No. It just means we have what we call non-Mendelian inheritance. It's when genes don't follow the basic fundamental laws of Mendel. So Mendel is a monk. He's not a trained scientist, so he couldn't really figure out all that there is about genetics. So this is just to supplement what he already worked on. So if the dominant allele isn't so dominant, what happens then? So if the dominant allele isn't so dominant anymore, we have 2 different ways it can go. The first is incomplete dominance. If the dominant allele cannot completely mask the recessive allele, that results in blended or intermediate traits. What do we mean? So for example, in this case, we have a pink flower. Pink and pink. So it's heterozygous in this case. So if we cross a pink flower with another pink flower, there's the possibility of a red flower, which is homozygous, a white flower, also homozygous, but a different allele. Now, for your heterozygous, instead of being dominant, because it's incompletely dominant, your red cannot completely dominate the white. Your red instead mixes or blends with the white. So red and white become pink. So it's a blended or intermediate trait. Incomplete dominance, intermediate traits. Let's go. Next, if neither allele is dominant enough, if neither of them is dominant at all, they're equally dominant, that's called codominance. So it results in combination traits. So if you mix a red allele with a white allele and they're codominant, you get roan. Roan means it's splotchy, it's patches of color. So in this case, it's both red and white, this cow. Okay, so again, codominance both at the same time, a combo of traits. Codominance combination. Let's go. What if there's more than just 2 alleles? So that's called a multiple allele system. One example is your ABO blood group. It's in the name itself, ABO. There's 3 different alleles, an allele for A, an allele for B, and an allele for O. I won't get into too much detail here because it's your job to explain it in the brainstorm discussion. Okay, but what you need to know is that there's 4 different types of blood types. Blood type A, blood type B, blood type AB, and blood type O. And that's dependent on their genotypes. Okay? And so there's 3 different alleles instead of just 2. What if there are multiple genes that affect the same trait? Again, multiple genes for one trait. Many genes, one trait. We call that a polygenic trait. Poly, many, genes. So many genes for one trait. It's kind of intuitive. So instead of one gene for one trait, we have many genes for one trait. That's a polygenic trait. One example is skin color. So skin color is complex. In order to be very, very dark skinned, you need to have many genes coding for dark skin. And that's why we have a spectrum of skin color, because there's many genes related to skin color. What if one gene affects many different traits? So it's the opposite now. One gene for many traits. Okay? We call that pleiotropy. That one's not as intuitive. So again, one gene, many traits. That's pleiotropy. One example is sickle cell anemia. So I'll let you figure that out in your brainstorm. Where are the genes located? Does it matter that they're on chromosomes? So does that affect the assortment of the genes? So yes, indeed it does. In independent assortment, they say that the genes don't affect one another. They're not inherited in sets. But if they're on chromosomes, which are long, long strands of DNA, technically they can be inherited in sets. And that's why we have the chromosomal theory of inheritance. This says no to the law of independent assortments. If they're on the same chromosome, then they're going to be inherited as one set most of the time, or at least frequently. Okay? So, review chromosomes. This is what we call a karyotype. Karyotype. A karyotype shows you the set of chromosomes in a genetic set, in the collection of DNA. So we have 2 types. We have autosomes, or body chromosomes, And we have sex chromosomes, which just determine your biological sex. So usually in a karyotype, it's always arranged in order of length, and then the last pair is always the sex chromosome. So if you're given a karyotype diagram, just look at the last two if you want to look at the sex chromosomes. Now, how do we figure out sex? Based on the chromosomes, for females, we have two X chromosomes, while for males, we have X and Y chromosomes. If you're given just a karyotype, if they're the same length, it's female. If they're different lengths, it's male. Now, what does that have to do with our genes? So there are traits that are on the sex chromosomes. These are called sex-linked traits. So if the gene is on the X or the Y chromosome, it will be inherited on that X or Y chromosome. Now, the thing is, for example, if it's on the Y chromosome, only males would have it. Okay? If that gene is on the Y chromosome, only males would have it because females don't get anything from the Y chromosome. They don't have a Y chromosome. Okay? So what happens is that a certain gene might be more common in one of the biological sexes. And the Punnett square is modified so that you have to consider the sex chromosomes. This is the father and this is the mother. XX and XY. Next, we have sex influence traits. So this one, it doesn't have to be on the sex chromosome, but it's influenced by the biological sex. So usually what this means is that the allele is dominant for one sex, but is recessive in the other sex. One example is baldness. In males, baldness is a dominant trait. For females, it's a recessive trait. So even though you have the same genotype, for females, they can still have hair, while for males, they get bald when they get older. Okay? Again, dominant for one sex, recessive for another, sex influence. Sex-limited traits, on the other hand, are limited by the biological differences between sexes. So for males, for example, we have testicles, we have balls. For females, they only have metaphorical balls, okay, if they're feisty. But they don't have actual biological testicles, unless you have intersex conditions, which we'll tackle if you go to STEM in senior high school. But anyway, girls generally can't get testicular cancer. They don't have balls, okay? So that's what we call a sex-limited trait. Testicular cancer is one example. So there are many ways to inherit genes. How do we figure out how a gene is inherited? Is it Mendelian? Is it non-Mendelian? One of the ways we can figure out is through pedigree analysis. So no, this isn't related to the brand of dog food. It's like this. So it's just a chart that allows us to look at how a gene is inherited through multiple generations in a family. So this is the legend. Females are circles, males are squares, because males are the ones with a pointy thing that we put in females. You're going to learn about that sometime. Grade 10 probably. Alright, so if you have that, we have pedigree charts like this. So females and males mate and produce produce offspring, and those offspring may or may not carry certain traits. So if they carry the trait that we're trying to trace, they will be shaded in. That shape will be shaded in. So what information does this give us? So how do we use pedigree analysis? Generally, we use it in this way. So first we ask, does the trait skip generations? So if it skips generations, as in like this, there's a dark circle here, and then this generation doesn't have a shaded shape, but it appears in the third generation. That means it skipped a generation. The only way that's possible is if it is a recessive trait, because you can have heterozygous individuals, carriers of certain recessive alleles. So they have a dominant allele that hides the recessive allele. So that's only possible in recessive if it skips generations. If no, it's most likely, that's supposed to say dominant. Again, if it's not, if it doesn't skip generations, it's most likely dominant. But there's still exceptions to the rule. It's still possible for it to be recessive, but not skipping generations. The only thing we're sure of is if it skips generations, it's definitely recessive. So again, no dominant. That should say dominant. And this is a definite yes, recessive. Next, does it appear more often in one particular sex? If yes, it's most likely sex-linked. If no, it's most likely autosomal. Again, we can't tell for sure unless we have a very, very large pedigree. Okay? So again, yes, sex-linked, no autosomal. Does it only appear in males? If yes, again, this is only if it's sex-linked. If we determine that it's sex-linked, Does it only appear in males? If yes, then it's definitely Y-linked because only males have a Y chromosome. No, if it doesn't appear, if it appears also in females, it's X-linked. Okay, so this is an example of an X-linked recessive trait. So, sir, how is it recessive if it doesn't skip generations? It does in this case. If you trace the actual lines, so this mom and this dad had offspring. Now, this particular child mated with another person. So this family, these two, it skipped their generation. So even though it appears in other siblings, at least for this pair, it skipped that pair's generation. So again, these people who are connected by marriage or mating, it skipped their mating pair. So since it skipped their mating pair, but it still appeared here, again, they're both white. They both did not exhibit the trait, but then they have a child that exhibited the trait. That still counts as being skipped, a skipped generation. So make sure to trace the lines that go down, not just whatever's in the same horizontal layer. Okay? So what are the odds of getting a combination of traits? We get that by looking at the probability in genetics. Step 1 is to make Punnett squares. That's the simplest way. We make Punnett squares to determine the probability of each genotype. Step 2 is to use probability laws to determine the probability of combination. So step 1, the Punnett squares, you should have already practiced that last year or in your brainstorm discussions. And your probability laws, basically these two laws. We have the addition law. So if you see the word either or, you just add the probabilities. For example, what's the chance that we get either a boy or a girl in our offspring? So there's a 50% chance to get a boy and a 50% chance to get a girl. So we get 50% plus 50%, we get 100%. For multiplication law, it's if your statement has the word both, the word and, or a specific number of repetitions. So in multiplication law, we multiply the probabilities. So for example, what's the chance we get 2 boys in our offspring? So we get 50%, that's the chance to get a boy. Multiply that by 50%, and we get 25%. We have a 25% chance of getting 2 boys if we get 2 children. The other possibilities are 2 girls, 1 boy, and 1 girl. Okay? So again, that's your addition law and your multiplication law. It gets more complicated in the future, but we won't get more complicated than these examples. Again, just look for the key words so that you can apply the probability laws. And that's pretty much it. Who we are is very, very complex. It could be Mendelian inheritance, these genes, or non-Mendelian inheritance. And take note, we have many genes. Hundreds, if not thousands of genes. So that's just the genetic side. We haven't even talked about the emotional side of things and our personalities and psychology and stuff. So you're a very, very unique person. And you know what? Even if you don't look like any of your parents, even if you are adopted, what matters is that they gave you more than just genes. Okay? They gave you their love. Alright? So respect yourself, love how unique you are, and respect genetics. It's complicated. I'll see you guys in the next topic.
That is over.